So welcome back. I'm Neil Brenner. I teach urban theory at this fine institution. It's wonderful to be here with everyone. It's really a privilege to chair this panel with two really cutting-edge thinkers about the contemporary urban condition. We have a slightly smaller group at this stage of the day, but just so everyone knows, some of the faculty have to teach and have other obligations, but will hopefully, I've been told they will be returning, so we can expect the size of the audience to fluctuate during the day, but we're delighted to have all of you with us. So, and I also just want to join my colleagues in thanking the DDES team, Boya, Liang, and Mojdeh for their incredible dedication and hard work. I started conversations with them many, many months ago about planning this, and you all have really rocked it in terms of not just the organizational coherence, but the intellectual vision behind the conference. It's really a wonderful opportunity for all of us at the school to reflect upon some fundamental issues that really underpin and animate the work that so many of us are doing, both in our research and in our practice. So hats off to the DDES team. And also, I just want to have a look at the list of, I mean, they went through it earlier, but have a look, if you haven't already, on the program of the list of all the different units at the GSD that have contributed to supporting this. So the effort to kind of construct the budget in order to make it possible to bring everyone here and to support this day was also a very non-trivial thing. And you know, we're all grateful to them for making that effort. And I also just want to reiterate their thanks to all the different departments and units around the GSD that have contributed. Because sometimes you have to cobble it together. You don't just have like a budget, okay, here it is, we can do the conference. You have to kind of go door to door and person to person, meet with people, and they did that. So a lot of work went on behind the scenes. So in terms of this, this afternoon's panel, the way I would frame it, pretty simple, but fundamental. We've been talking about the forming of a certain process, the spatial structuration of a certain process. But what about the urban? So to some degree, the last panel was wrestling. The urban was there, of course, but to some degree, in the foreground was the question of the sort of spatial patterning. And that'll certainly still be on the table today with both of our authors, both of our speakers, but also in the foreground, the urban itself. What is the urban? How do we understand it as a spatial crystallization and as a process of ongoing negotiation and transformation? How do we understand its geographies? How do we measure it? How do we conceptualize it? I think both of our speakers today are really at the cutting edge of attempts in a variety of different disciplines to wrestle with those questions. So I'm going to introduce both speakers at once, and maybe just a word or two about why I think they're so important to this problematique, and then I'll turn it over to them, and they've promised to adhere to the rigorous 20-minute rule. So Colin McFarlane, and my introductions are going to be pretty brief. I think people are pretty familiar with these speakers, but I just say a few words. Colin McFarlane is professor of geography at Durham University, really one of the best geography departments in the world. He's the author of many articles in probably some of the best human geography, urban geography, political, economic, cultural geography journals in the world. He also wrote a book called Learning the City, and he has edited many other books. His key agendas involve investigating the experience and politics of informal urban neighborhoods, specifically with reference to, among other issues, sanitation. He's worked extensively in Mumbai. He's also worked in Cape Town, and a number of other African cities. He's now involved in a very large-scale, long-term project studying a variety of different Asian cities in comparative perspectives. Shlomo Angel, Sali Angel, is professor of city planning at the NYU Marin Institute, my former university, NYU, but it was before the Marin Institute was founded. Sali is the author of many books, many articles in urban social science journals around the world. Among his recent and, I think, really foundational contributions to the field are Planet of Cities and Atlas of Urban Expansion, which are attempts to empirically document the spatial reorganization of urban life on a world scale. And I'm sure that we'll hear more about that project today. Sali has, he's program director of the Urban Expansion Project at NYU, and he's also been an advisor to the UN, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and so forth. So as you will shortly see, these authors in many ways have allied questions, but they confront those questions in radically different ways. So Solly is someone who has spent a lot of time for many years trying to empirically document urbanization and urban expansion. This poses tremendous problems of data collection. And I view Solly as someone who, as many of you will know, Kingsley Davis back in the 1950s and 60s was one of the pioneers of trying to confront the problem of developing a kind of standardized data set through which to measure global urbanization. And I view Solly Angel as really kind of, if I may put it this way, and it's intended as flattering, certainly not as critique, because I really admire Kingsley Davis's work, but he's a kind of a contemporary version of a Kingsley Davis project in the age of geospatial and GIS data. Because obviously Kingsley Davis had to rely on census data. He didn't really have anything else. And he did the best he could. And now we have a lot of tools and a lot of data at our disposal. And Solly, and you'll hear about this today, Solly's really taking that problematique forward in very sophisticated, empirically revealing ways. So I look forward to hearing that. Colin McFarlane has spent many years doing empirical, ethnographic, neighborhood-based research in Mumbai and a number of other cities, as I mentioned earlier. So he's someone who's very concretely grounded in the quotidian, everyday experience of cities. But one thing that Colin also really puts into the foreground, and which I expect we'll hear about from his lecture today, is the question of conceptualization. What kinds of categories are appropriate for understanding rapidly changing urban life around the world? And one thing that I find extremely provocative about Colin's work, among many things, is that he's not afraid to invent and develop new concepts. And that's something that he's been doing in a variety of different projects around questions about urban assemblage. And also yesterday we had a wonderful discussion about the concept, which to some degree is an older concept, but Colin's reinventing it, of the urban fragment. But at the same time, currently, Colin is working in very innovative ways on questions of urban density. And the concept of density is obviously a quite well-established concept in empirical urban research and in a variety of other forms of urban design research. And Colin is engaged in an effort to, I would say, radically reconceptualize how we understand what density and densification processes are all about. So Colin works on a very grounded level in places, but he puts into the foreground questions of conceptualization as a way to try to make sense of what he's seeing on the ground. So thank you both for being with us. We very much look forward to your papers and the opportunity to discuss them. And we actually didn't discuss in advance what order to go in. Maybe you did. Are you willing to go first, Solly? Perfect. So let's hear it for Solly Angel.
Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you, the organizers, for inviting me and for putting together such an interesting event with such interesting people. I will take this opportunity to present an article that I just wrote in the last few weeks in response to a journal article that was published that said everything you've heard about global urbanization turns out to be wrong. That was the name of the article. And the main claim of the article was that the European Commission, which has a very strong research department with its own satellite and with a huge group of people working in several cities in Europe, claims that 84% of the world population is now urbanized. And that has bothered me. So I had to stop doing what I'm doing, got all our team to work to show that this simply cannot be true. And it ties nicely into some of the work that Neil has done about what is urban and how do we define it. So that's what I'm going to focus my work on. This is not my own work, of course. It's a collaboration of all the people that are listed below. Now, the reason that this is important is that every once in a while a number is being floated that then gets taken up by the media and by other academics who don't have time to generate their own numbers, and that creates serious biases in terms of policies and of cities and national governments and international organizations. One great example of that is a 2003 document by the UN called The Challenge of Slums, which starts out by a statement by the UN Secretary General at the time, the old Kofi Annan, who just passed away a couple of weeks ago. Almost 1 billion people, or 32% of the world's urban population, lives in slums. And if no serious action is taken, the number of slum dwellers worldwide is projected to rise over the next 30 years to about 2 billion. And that 1 billion number was repeated and amplified uncritically by hundreds of media outlets, as well as by numerous academic publications and a widely circulated book called Planet of Cities. Now, I have been working in the cities of the developing countries. Next year, it will be 50 years. I started out in a barriada outside Lima, spending a month there in 1969. And it was very clear to me that it's not possible that a third of the urban population lives in slums, whatever you choose to call these things. I complained about that, and I assembled an expert group meeting of World Bank people, Population Council people, UN Habitat people, and when that expert group meeting came time to issue its aid memoir, the chief statistician of UN Habitat said, "We're not going to change it." And I said, "Why?" And he said, she said, she was a Turkish lady, "The executive director likes this number." So that was the end of that discussion about the million. And I am afraid that that 84% is going to stick, and that is why I decided to dedicate some time to investigate it. Now, the urbanization, the share of the people living in cities is published regularly by the UN Population Division in this World Urbanization Prospects. It used to come out every 2 years. It comes out now every 4 years, and it claims that right now 55% of the world population lives in cities, as compared with the European Commission's Atlas of the Human Planet that came out in 2016 that claims that there are 84% living in cities. Now, the problem with the, sorry, did I do something? How do I point? This is how I point, right. So the problem with the World Urbanization Prospects is that the UN, by its mandate, has to accept numbers from member states. It cannot generate its own numbers, like the World Bank or the IMF. They've got their own data, they've got their own statistical offices. The UN just gets numbers from member states and has to use whatever numbers that it is being given. So if a state defines a city as having so many people, and therefore so much of a percentage of the people live in cities, so much for that. The UN has to publish this result. So that has been questioned by a lot of people. Neil and his colleague Schmidt have, of course, questioned that, but that's been questioned by demographers all over. So nobody really questions the population numbers and the population projections of countries, but people always question the urban share of that population, because there's so many different ways of defining it. And it may well be that that number is wrong, that 55% number is wrong. It looks okay to me compared to the 84%. So I've decided to look into it in a little bit greater detail. So the issue is, what do we mean by urban, of course? That's the issue. Now, clearly, we have this famous quote by Neil and his colleague Schmidt. I don't know if it's famous.
Christian.
Christian Schmidt, it is clear that settlement-based understanding of the urban conditions have become obsolete. The urban cannot be plausibly understood as a bounded and closed site of social relations that's to be contrasted with non-urban zones or conditions. Today, urbanization is a process that affects the whole territory of the world and not only isolated parts of it. There is, in short, no longer any outside to the urban world. The non-urban has been largely internalized within an uneven yet planetary process of urbanization. So we're up against that. This is a serious critique, and do we want to give up on that idea or not? So me, as a kind of a committed urban geographer, I refuse to give up on that idea because I still think that the world is made up of settlements. So when you look at the geography of the world, you see settlements. These are villages in Henan, in China, and you can see that they are actually distinct. So it may be that they share a lot of conditions. And back to Louis Wirth and urbanism as a way of life. And yes, we've all become urban. We all have cell phones. We all maybe look at television if we're close enough. But for me, there's still an issue of settlement, and that we can, when we have settlements, we can talk about settlements large and small. And it seems to me that the distinction between the urban and the not urban can still be somehow settlement related, in contrast to what Neil and Christian are saying. So from our perspective, to start with, a contiguous built-up area of 100,000 people is a city. So we are assuming that, and we have then tried to list all the cities that fall into this category. So what you see here is a map of all the settlements of 100,000 people or more that had 100,000 people or more in 2010, and there are 4,231 of those. And my colleague Nicolas, who is here, was responsible for putting this list together. It took a couple of years. And in almost all countries, except in China, 100,000 people is understood to be a city. In China, you still have to fight to be a city, and there are only 661 cities in China, even though there's some places of $1 million people or more who haven't gotten the designation city, and China continues to fight it and has sent its own demographer to the UN Population Division to argue that its idea of a city is still okay. We focused the analysis of cities in more detail on a global sample of cities. This is a kind of a random stratified sample of 200 cities that we have studied in greater detail. And what we wanted to do is create an idea of a settlement that is created by contiguity, by built-up spaces being in close proximity to each other. And the way that we've done that is with, I'm going to go very quickly over that because that's not what the discussion is about. These are Landsat 30-meter pixels. You can actually start seeing how many of those pixels have a majority of pixels in a square kilometer around them that are also built up. So places that have a lot of pixels around them that are built up are considered urban. And then you can talk about places that have less to be between 25% and 50% to be suburban. And then you talk about those that have less as being rural. And then you can talk about the fringe open space in and around cities. And then you keep going, and then you create a kind of a space that has a boundary. And that includes both built up areas and captured open spaces, and you can look at that as a single footprint. And then you can start talking about urban expansion, and you can start to see how this footprint expands over time. And this is like, let's say, Addis Ababa between 1990 and 2010, so that is the 1990 space in the light color, and then the dark red is the 2010 space. And then we can start talking about urban expansion, and we can start talking about what area were built when, and we can start to get an understanding of how the city is expanding over time. Now, the important thing of all this analysis is what we mean by a city. So first of all, we have an edge. The whole idea is to create an edge. So in that sense, we take the Roman definition of the extrema tectorum, which I'm sure Paul Vittorio is familiar with, and that is defining the city by how far it exists, how far it's built. Tectorum means built, architect, master builder. So, and the other idea behind the idea of a city is that what creates a city is contiguity. That the whole idea of the urban is an idea of moving from being closer to the land to being closer to each other. Now, when you are closer to the land, you have to be in smaller settlements because you have to be close to the land. And when you move to the city, you give up on that closeness to the land to be closer to each other, to exchange goods and services, to learn from each other, to create economies of scale, to create, to innovate. All of these things happen by intense interactions between people, and what creates those interactions is the closeness. So the whole idea of moving, of what we call the urbanization project, the movement of people from being closer to the land to being closer to each other, is a movement that started in earnest in around the 1800s, when there were between 5 and 10% of the population living in cities and the rest lived in rural areas, to 2007, when there were 50% living in cities, to 2100, when there will be 75 or 80% living in cities, and that project will come to an end. So this entire movement, this entire reorganization of society from a rural society where 90% of the people live in the rural area to a place where the great majority lives in urban areas is going to be over in a matter of 300 years or 12 generations. Now, when we look at these settlements, we can see, oh boy, this is, sorry, this is not, I have to go much quicker. So, I'm sorry. So, we look at these settlements, their boundaries, and now we ask ourselves how many people live in these places. There are 4 arguments that we present. One is the share of the labor force in agriculture. The second is regularities in settlement hierarchies. 3 is high-density agricultural regions, and 4 are typical densities on the urban fringe. So I have to go very quickly. 27% of all workers live employed in agriculture, and there were like 30% non-farm employment, and households were larger in rural areas. That means that about 40% of the people lived in rural areas in 2015. So that means that at most 60% of the people lived in cities. We looked at regularities and settlement hierarchies. We created a list of all the cities that have 20,000 people or more. And as you know, there's Zipf's law that says that the number of, if you rank cities by size, they go very clearly on a straight line, so that people can't hear me?
It's for the recording.
Oh, it's being recorded.
Handheld, Colin?
No. Okay, I just have to be quick because I don't have time. So anyway, what we see here is if we graph the cities according to size from 5 to 10,000, 10 to 20,000, the number of cities lines up very on a straight line. And when we do the city size, they line up again. And the correlation, the R square is 0.9999. So what you see is that this allows us to project how many people live in cities of 5,000 or more, which is like the break point of these European Commission people. And we again conclude that that would mean that about 55% of the world population lives in cities of 5,000 and more, not 84% like they're saying. High density agricultural region, again, the break point for this analysis of the European Commission is 300 people per square kilometer. This is a very low density. And with that low density, Java, for example, the average density in Java is 1,000 people per square kilometer. And if you calculate, you can see that most of the cultivated land in Java is considered to be urban. So 96% of the rural areas in Java is considered urban according to that, to those calculations. And finally, when you think about 300 people per square kilometer as the density on the urban edge, 300 people per square kilometer, take a square kilometer, take a quarter of it for transportation, and you're left with 750,000 meters. Think of 300 people in households of 4. So that's 75 families. 75 families occupying 750,000 meters is 10,000 square meters per family. That is basically 2 football fields with a house in the middle. So there's no surprise that when they, let's say, map Dhaka, the dark color is what we see as Dhaka. The red is what they see as Dhaka. So it's within the study area, which is the yellow, it's 4 times larger. Within that picture, it's 11 times larger. So what happens is generally that these people take too much land as urban. And I just want to, in the minute that is left for me, to say why this is important, and we can discuss it further. First of all, it's dangerous to say that 84% of the world is urbanized, because then the idea is, okay, so it's over. We don't have to worry about it. Now it's all about repair of urban settlements. And the way I look at it, there's still 2.5 million people that are going to come into cities in the next, between now and 2050, and we have to prepare for them. So saying that they're already there is not particularly helpful. And when we talk about urbanization, we still have a lot of African urbanization. 33% of the new urban population between now and 2050 will be in Africa. Another 25% will be in the Indian subcontinent. These are serious trends that we have to prepare for and contend with, and telling us that the world is already urbanized is not going to get us there. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil, and thanks to the organisers who've put together really great events. I've already learnt loads this morning, and it's been really fascinating, so thanks for that and the opportunity to be here. Before we go on to the next slide, Solly, you said at the start, 1 in 3 people living in slums is wrong. What is the number? Just out of curiosity.
I don't know the number. I'm just saying they keep bringing
right.
the number down.
Yeah.
So now they're at about 800,000 instead of the 2 billion.
Oh, really?
Billion, and yeah. It's probably around 500 million.
Right. Okay. The reason I ask is partly because, you know how you were talking about academics repeating the same thing over and over again? I mean, it's not something I would do, but other people would do it. So what I was kind of hoping was to get you when you were sitting down and change the number before I got up here. But it's I'm looking forward to seeing that research, because I'm guilty of that as well, repeating that number over and over again. So hands up on that one. And I mean, it's a lot of people. I think we can say that informal settlements are urbanizing faster than cities more generally, oftentimes. And as you say, preparing for that is vital. So I guess in a way, what my talk's going to be about is looking over some of my research over the last year or two, and also looking to some of the work I'm about to start, which Neil mentioned around kind of comparative urbanisms in Asia, and try to say a little bit about the concepts I've been using in my work and how they might relate to one another. And the whole kind of challenge, I suppose, at the heart of my work is how to make sense of the experience and the politics of life in informal neighbourhoods. So what I want to do, I suppose, is kind of move through sort of 4 steps. And apologies to those of you who were at the kind of urban theory lab discussion yesterday, because some of this will be familiar, but hopefully we won't be repeating the same points exactly, but some of it will be familiar to you. The first point, I guess, and this is me looking at the work I'm doing at the moment, but also, I guess, in a way, this kind of sums up my work, is that for the urban poor, for those living in these informal neighbourhoods, oftentimes urbanism is a density of relations between people, fragments, and social infrastructures. And I want to work with these 3 terms, fragments, social infrastructures, and density in the talk. But running through each of these 3 concepts, the way in which I've come to use them is always freighted with a notion of multiplicity, an idea of the city, of the urban, being irreducibly pluralized and diverse. And that multiplicity of fragments, of social infrastructures, of density, being primarily kind of refracted through the experience of the city, the perception of the city, the aspirations of what the city might bring for you and for others around you. And that multiplicity itself being a challenge in terms of how we as urban researchers, I'm an urban geographer, but a challenge in terms of how we might work with that multiplicity or not, right? How do we work with the multiplicity that characterizes urban life, urban politics? But nonetheless, as challenging as that is, it also can catalyze new ideas. Working with multiplicity enlivens and spreads the kind of parameters of urban thinking, urban possibility. So the challenge then is connecting these approaches and ideas to then the state, the local state in particular, which is itself a multiple entity, in terms of trying to make some kind of influence that improves the lives of those living in informal neighbourhoods. So that's, I guess, the kind of 4 steps through which my work is kind of trying to explore things. So when I talk about multiplicity, I suppose I partly have in mind some recent work, people like Ashley Mean and Nigel Frith, their book Seeing Like a City. Before that, Warren Magnuson's book, Politics of Urbanism, Seeing Like a City, a term that keeps getting used in the urban literature, seeing like a city. And what that phrase is about and the way it's being used is really about trying to understand the multiplicity of the city itself, trying to work with the city as we find it. So trying to build an understanding of urban life and urban politics from the very complexity and multiplicity of the goings-ons in the city, the power plays, the differences, the different actors that we find there. And what I try to do, I suppose, in my work is from that produce concepts which are kind of at what I would call a sort of mid-range theorizing. So they're not kind of necessarily kind of high abstraction, but they're not either simply trying to describe the multiplicities kind of over and over again. They're trying to hover slightly above those multiplicities and to anchor understanding of urban life as we see it unfolding. So the concepts then try to work with multiplicity, try to evolve, and try to avoid a kind of disciplining set of parameters in that sense. So that's how I'm using the terms density, fragments, and social infrastructure. I'm thinking of them in these kind of ways as kind of mid-level concepts, and running through them as this theme of multiplicities, and then this question of how that might lead to influencing or trying to influence the state in certain contexts. So I just want to run through these 3 concepts very, very briefly, talk about some of the interrelationships and some of the challenge of using them. So the first thing then, the first concept is density. There's a huge literature around density that we all kind of know about, Solly will know extremely well. Literature that's seeking to define density, other literature which is seeking to optimize density in some way, for environmental or social reasons and so on, and literature which is kind of criticising or exploring critically the way in which density is produced, the way in which it's sifted and sorted through, for example, capitalist urbanisation, deindustrialisation, and so on and so forth. And this work, I think, is vital. It's important for how we understand cities. And I kind of take, I suppose, two things from it. The first is that density is an inherently kind of networked problem space. It's always made into a problem in relation to some other sphere of urban life, whether it's the environment in terms of carbon reduction, or security, or economy in terms of innovation, or social life in terms of cohesive communities, and so on and so forth. And the second thing I take from this literature is that density is not just a context for how people live in the city, but also a resource. It's a way of trying to organise urban life. It provides opportunities for people to organise, to negotiate, to think about ways of influencing the local state, to provide for their own neighbourhoods, and so on and so forth. So someone like Abdelmalek Simon, who some of you will know, has, I think, been very important in this regard. His work has really been exploring how ordinary neighbourhoods and informal markets are structured as dense spaces through kind of a variety of, sort of social devices that kind of allow these spaces to be lived and negotiated. So he talks about improvisations, he talks about speculations, he talks about trade-offs, the way in which, for example, market traders help and collaborate with one another, or come into conflict with one another, or use one another in some form in order to get something done or avoid something negative happening to them. So in this kind of way in which density becomes more than just a context that we find, but an active forwarding into forms of social and economic relation, a kind of resource. So Abdelmalek, I think, is opening up a kind of grammar of density for thinking about the social, economic, and political differences that shape density. What I think, though, is missing from some of this literature, or what I think perhaps Abdelmalek opens up, is a question then of how residents themselves experience and perceive and use densities. And this is the first key concept for me. And this is at the heart of the new project, which Neil mentioned, which the European Research Council has funded, which tries to compare the ways in which residents themselves inhabit and use densities across multiple kind of Asian contexts. So that's the first concept that I want to think about. The second is very much interrelated to this, is the notion of fragments. And here I'm thinking particularly of material fragments. And the way I'm thinking about density is as a kind of interrelation of people and fragments. So fragments themselves become a kind of urban problem space in terms of how people experience and politicize the city in relation to the density of poor, informal neighbourhoods, of low-income neighbourhoods. And some of this work has been motivated by collaborative work that I've done over the years in Rafinagar in Mumbai, an informal settlement where a lot of a very poor informal settlement in the northeast of the city, largely Muslim neighbourhoods, where life is materially very fragmented in terms of housing, in terms of water, in terms of toilet blocks and infrastructures, and people are constantly having to work with these fragments, and to do so in context of density. And that density, as I said earlier, is an active part of that working through fragments. So fragments then are materialities that are inadequate in some way, dysfunctional, unreliable, broken, insufficient. They have different ways of registering as fragments. So yes, they're materials, but they become made in the city through their relationships in particular times and particular spaces. So the ways in which they become fragments is multiple in that sense, just as density is multiple in the sense of, in the ways in which people experience and use it. So there's a long history of thinking about fragments. I won't go into that here. I've got Walter Benjamin on the slides. There's other people more recently working with fragments, people like Philip de Boek in African cities, people like Swati Chattopadhyay in India, and there's a kind of larger literature on kind of the bits and pieces of urbanism and how people, in this case in dense neighbourhoods, are able to use or negotiate these fragments in order to experience and politicise the city. I'll just say one last thing about that. In these images of Cape Town, this gets really to the heart, and we talked about this yesterday, this gets to the heart of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this idea of reinventing fragments, or fragments being made in relations, so they therefore can become reinvented. So this is fragmented kind of bucket toilet infrastructures that were provided to the neighbourhoods of Barcelona and Cape Town, and the residents kind of refusing those fragments by demolishing them and insisting instead on a more complete working infrastructure, just like some of the white neighbourhoods down the road. This bottom picture is activists emptying buckets of human waste on the steps of the state legislature, so taking fragments and reinventing them in a new context. So that sense in which people are, in a sense, using fragments to politicise the drama of density in poor neighbourhoods by drawing attention to the fact that these infrastructures do not serve those densities. So the third concept is social infrastructure, and this is the reason I'm using this concept in my work is because it gets to the fact that because in dense neighbourhoods, infrastructures and services are fragmented, because they are so fragmented and always often have been, people have to develop, of course, ways of, in a sense, as Abdelmalik Simone again puts it in a different context, peopling infrastructure, becoming infrastructure, acting socially as infrastructures in different kinds of short and long-term collectives, sometimes around ethnic lines or religious lines or class lines or some other form of formal or informal social organisation. So this is some work I've done with colleagues in Kampala and what we're trying to, and with Jonathan Silver at Sheffield University. And what we're trying to do there is think about the forms of collaboration that arise when you have fragmented material urbanisms as a kind of day-to-day reality of life and livelihoods. So here we're looking at a neighbourhood called Namawongo in central Kampala, informal neighbourhoods, and other very sort of poor neighbourhoods. And we're trying to work with 6 residents in particular and to explore how they differently negotiate each other and the relations in the neighbourhood in order to build these social infrastructures that deal with the fragments of urban life in quite dense kind of contexts. So the way in which we did that is that we followed these 6 residents, quite different people, from different economic and social contexts around the city. We interviewed them several times. We did these follow-along methods in which they talked about how they move around the neighbourhood, around the city, and they talked about the kind of the toing and froing of densities. They talked about their encounters with material infrastructures and so on, and we kind of started to map this out with them. We then sort of tried to kind of bring together the kind of multiplicities that I talked about around social infrastructures into these kind of 4 particularly important social infrastructures that we saw as being vital to how people use density to address sort of material fragments, right? So we had these kind of 4 mid-level concepts of social infrastructures: care, consolidation, coordination, and speculation. I can't go into that in too much detail, but the challenge we were wrestling with here was to try to find conceptual anchors amongst the very multiple stories we were getting from just these 6 residents and also the other people we spoke to in Namawongo for how they negotiate, experience and politicise urban life in the context of fragmentation and density. So just one example then, given the time, I'll talk about care. These are just 2 of the residents we worked with. So some of these ways in which social infrastructure was working. This is Jennifer at the top. She is part of a women's group that helps train other women in the neighbourhood how to make jewellery and then sell that jewellery. She's part of a savings group that helps people save for everyday essentials, and she gets women involved in that, mainly women, some men as well. She's linked to the church and uses the church to help get families into schools, children to schools, and also to help build sanitation facilities. So she's involved in various institutions, formal and informal, and she's a kind of important sort of node in these social infrastructures. She's kind of giving shape to these social infrastructures, which she's constantly kind of tweaking at and working at in a really kind of laborious way in order to kind of help address these material fragments. And here, density is absolutely a kind of key resource. I can't go into detail on this, but Jennifer talked a lot about locating activities in the neighbourhood, in particular areas that were denser, where you can use people together to build stuff, to interact with each other and so on, bringing people together in different ways. Josephine, on the other hand, is more dependent on these social infrastructures. She's not shaping them so much. She sells fruit and veg in the city centre, and she's very dependent on people like Jennifer, neighbours in the neighbourhood, who will watch her kids when she goes to work, who will help her get her son into school, who will help her improve her house whenever there's damage to the house from a storm or whatever, and so on and so forth. So she's very dependent on these infrastructures for getting some of these fragmented kind of conditions addressed. So these three mid-level concepts then, density, fragments, and social infrastructure, are what I've been kind of trying to work with, and I'm trying to think more about the interrelationship between them. I'm trying to think about these as multiplicities, as kind of constantly evolving, changing, and always pluralized concepts rather than as singular things. And I'm trying to think about the state as well. So the way in which I'm trying to think about this is to stay with the multiplicity, to stay with the multiple stories and encounters people have with fragments or with social infrastructures, which is a kind of challenge. And this is very much at the heart of the density project that I just started, that I mentioned earlier, to stay with the multiplicity rather than to reduce to a single framework or kind of position. And I'm inspired here by people like Jane Jacobs, working in Singapore, who's talked about kind of ways of urban theorization which tried to stage multiplicity, tried to kind of think about the city as a series of additions and differentiations rather than a single kind of general urban theory. And I'm quite drawn to the style of urbanism. And thinking about the role of key differentials in those multiplicities, such as gender and race and class and so on. So staging multiplicity. And one of the ways in which we try to do that, I'll just mention this in the last couple of minutes, in Kampala, is through an exhibition. We built an exhibition at the Uganda National Museum. And the reason we used an exhibition was partly because it allows us to compare different representations, as Bruno Latour puts it here, of urban life and urban politics, and then to kind of form conversations around that multiplicity and to aggregate up into these kind of mid-level concepts, which can then be used to try to influence the state, which is, you know, a difficult and slow process. So we built this exhibition in 2015, celebrating Namawongo, which tried to tell the multiple stories of life in the neighbourhood. That was the only aim, to try to tackle some of the negative representations of the neighbourhoods in the city and to try to kind of curate a new conversation about Namawongo that remained irreducibly multiple. So we tell the stories about the fragments, about the social infrastructures, about how people cope. These are some of the images from the exhibition of the people we followed around and talked to a lot. And people came from the neighbourhood and they talked about the exhibition, which was designed, I mean, all these images were drawn by residents in the neighbourhood who helped us do the exhibition together. That's the museum. We had focus groups and discussion groups. And some of the kind of issues that came up, you know, people wanted to talk about HIV/AIDS a lot because of the, I can't go into detail, but it's a big issue in Uganda. People want to talk about widows. People want to talk about housing. You know, so the conversation was about challenges and about social infrastructures and fragments and about the role of the state. One thing just one person to flag up was Mehdi. I think Mehdi is an NGO director who came to the exhibition, and he was talking about how the exhibition allowed him to see the neighbourhood slightly differently. And for me, this was about him seeing the neighbourhood in a slightly more multiple way. So he's been working in a neighbourhood as an NGO director for years, working on housing, land and water, but now he's talking about also seeing the density of relations and social infrastructures through which people cope and get by. And he talks about the need to nurture this in different ways. So he's talking about this. For me, this was about him seeing both the fragments and the social infrastructures and ways of nurturing that as a kind of politics. So staying with the multiplicities, in other words. Now, this is very challenging, this kind of question of staying with multiplicity. There was some of the residents came back to us and talked about the issues that were absent. Of course, you know, you're never going to represent fully any neighbourhood, or of course you can't. It's not a sort of ludicrous objective, but nonetheless, trying to work with multiplicities inevitably leaves you in a position where you kind of you lose certain issues. So some of the people talked about how there wasn't enough on unemployment or homelessness and so on. And so we discussed this, how you capture and how you resonate the stories of a neighbourhood through an exhibition. I think I've got have I got any time at all? I've got no?
But give us a conclusion. I mean,
1 minute.
Yeah. So,
right. Well, I can't talk about the state, but I guess what I wanted to say, if I'd not packed in too many slides here, was that trying to take these stories about the interrelationships between fragments and social infrastructures and their multiplicities to the state is obviously a huge challenge, particularly when the state is so often so hostile to neighbourhoods like Namawongo and itself so multiple, and also the state, even when it's very, very willing to help out with some of these issues, is lacking resources. And you've got, there was a kind of, I wanted to talk a little bit about different ways in which I've been thinking about how we might work with the state. I don't have the time to do that. But just for example, ACT Together, that's the director that I mentioned, the NGO I mentioned a moment ago that Medi directs, ACT Together in Kampala. One of the things they've done is spend a long time working with particular municipal officials on the ground and building relationships up with them and trying to bring those officials to neighbourhoods. So we tried to bring some of them to the exhibition and we tried to talk to them about the kind of multiple needs of the neighbourhoods. Other examples might be people who know Mumbai would know about the organisation URBS, which spends a lot of time trying to work. As I see it, they're working with the density of of people and things, and they're trying to support social infrastructures. They're trying to support people as they do the work, as residents do the work of working with fragments. And I think that's quite inspiring. There's other movements like Right to P who have a different approach. I can't talk about. Sorry, I've just got 2 of my slides. So I'll just leave it there because I think that I've probably just talked too long. But that's what I'm trying to say. That's my kind of key challenge, I guess, to better understand and support the social infrastructures through which inhabitants in poor neighbourhoods produce, manage, alter and contest fragments, and to force new imaginaries and practices of living densities. That's kind of, hopefully a few years from now I'll have a book that might address that, but at the moment it's just questions and no answers. So anyway, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Colin. Thank you, Sally. So my proposal is this. I'm going to invite Sally to ask a question of Colin. And even though Colin's still just getting settled here, I'm sure you have questions for Sally. And we'll give them just one question to each and then give them a chance to respond. And then we're going to open it up to all of you. So get your questions ready. And basically the way I like to do this, and I'm confident that it's going to work, I'm going to collect a bunch of questions. I want lots of people to get into this conversation instead of just a few questions and responses. And then at some point we'll turn it back over to the panel. And they can pick and choose what they want to respond to. But instead of just back and forth, that way it's really like, let's reflect on the fundamental issues that have been put on the table and have a conversation. And then at some point, we'll do a couple rounds, and then we'll turn it back over to Sally and Colin. Are you guys good with that? We've got 40 minutes, give or take. So get your questions ready. But first, why don't we invite Sally to ask a question of Colin, and then vice versa, and then we give you both a chance to respond just to get us warmed up here. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yep. Sally.
Well,
thank you. You don't have to, but I'm sure you have a question.
I'd rather wait.
You want to wait? Okay, that's totally fine.
Wait.
I mean, if you guys just want to open it up to the floor now, that's also fine. It was just kind of an idea.
I've got a question.
Yeah, please.
I mean, is this thing on, as they say? Is it on?
If it's
on.
green, yep, it's on.
Yeah. So it's a bizarre thing, this, isn't it? Yeah. So no, I think I guess my question is, is there a kind of distinction between sort of what you're doing, kind of a study of the demographic extent of urbanization, right? Is that what you're doing? A kind of demographic counting of cities, right? That's how I understand what you're doing. And it's not answering the question, what is a city? And I'm just kind of, I noticed when you talked a lot, you were equating counting kind of people in what we may or may not agree are urban areas with the question of what a city is. And I was wondering, is that a very deliberate kind of thing? Because I think about cities, and when you were talking about, for example, people being brought close to one another, I was thinking that opens up the question of urban experience, how people sort of shift the way in which they live, all that stuff you mentioned, urbanism as a way of life. And, those are the kind of dimensions where we might get into a different kind of discussion about what a city is. And so I just wanted to hear a bit more about how you saw that kind of dilemma in if it was a dilemma in your work.
Right. Let me respond by saying, first of all, I have no interest in demography per se. You know, I'm not a demographer. I'm looking at these at cities. You might say, if the way that I would define it, as a locus of interactions. So I think that the distinction that I was trying to make for this particular kind of presentation is that, and my interests, if you're asking me at the bottom line, my interests are in urban planning and in the policies that would make cities more productive, more inclusive, more sustainable, more resilient. That's what I'm interested in. So I'm not interested in the numbers per se. The numbers are of no interest to me. The reason that I have been working on urban expansion is very simple, and that is when I used to go to a mayor and I say, look, in the next 25 years, your city is going to triple in size, I was laughed out of the room. So I said, okay, I'm going to go and measure global urban expansion. And then when I come in, I say, look, like all other cities, your city is going to triple in size in the next 25 years, and I get a hearing. So the reason that I did all this work is basically to get a hearing and to say to the mayor, like I was, very nicely put by Pierre in the earlier discussion, there's the res publica and the res privata, and that res publica has to be put in place before the res privata, and we've forgotten about that. And so that is my intention, and that is to find out how cities develop, and to introduce the res publica into this equation.
Perfect. Thank you. So let's open it up. Who wants to start? And if you could kindly identify yourself, probably we know who you are, but our visitors might not, and then we'll take it from there. Andres. I'll give you this. Or no, actually, Boya's got one. Yep.
Thank you. I'm Andres Lefebvre. I teach in the urban planning department and urban design department here. My question is mostly to Solly. I've followed the work over the years, and I really admire what your team and you have been doing to sort of document and with evidence and data, understand what goes on in the world in terms of urbanization. And it seems to me that there's an opportunity that's just about to open up, and I want to sort of understand your take on it, because my reading of the situation is that it's not quite there yet. But having longitudinal urban extent data that we can track over time, decade to decade, as you have done, seems to open the possibility to, for a large scale kind of experiment in understanding how well policies work in terms of actually shaping metropolitan form.
Right.
And if we think about, for instance, back to the discussion on density that Colin evoked, there's a lot of people in the world who would argue that density is 99%, or maybe let's say 90%, a result of geography. Hong Kong is dense because there's nowhere else to build, or LA can sprawl because there's land to sprawl, etc. But that, as planners, doesn't help us at all.
Right.
That's inevitable.
Right.
What helps us is to understand how well a particular planning approach or policy works. Mm-hmm. And that tracking that from the global extent data seems to be becoming possible to sort of to track whether cities of particular sorts globally have implemented certain approaches, plans, policies, institutions, and be able to use global extent data as evidence to understand how that has actually affected reality. And I think it provides an interesting opportunity to also kind of build bridges between geography planning and urban design in very specialized ways. And I have a second part of the question, just maybe ties in both to Colin and to Solly, which is there's also a sense, I think, amongst I would dare say most planning community, to some extent, urban design and geography perhaps too, that there is no such thing as optimal density. And in many ways, I would agree with that. And I've sort of, over the years, seen many instances where different sorts of densities work for different contexts, etc. But I've also come to believe that taking a neutral position on that becomes quite dangerous in the wake of massive resource consumption that cities consume and massive shortages of resources that lots of parts of the world face, whether it's in water or in land or food or other parts. And I want to understand both of your take, whether you think there is not a global optimal, but in every context of a city, a density that you think is desirable. Thanks.
So Sally, I was going to collect, and I still kind of want to, but he's obviously asked you some pretty fundamental questions. So can we go ahead and invite Sally to respond, just because they're fairly specific, and also Colin, if you'd like, and then maybe we open it up, or?
Yes.
Yeah, please.
Fine. These are two very good questions. On the first question, I think you correctly said that if we model density, three factors, population, income, and topography explain a huge percent of the variation between cities. So more populated cities are denser, richer cities are less dense than poorer ones, and cities in bad topographies are denser. So 85% of urban extent is explained only by population and income. So the policies don't have much room to influence density. And most density policies in general, containment policies of one kind or the other, have failed. And that is something to think about, because a failure of containment means unplanned development. I mean, it's like I didn't want it to expand, so I didn't plan for it because I don't want it to expand. So that's part of the question. Now there are some policy differences that do affect density. There's a paper out. It's only a draft by a colleague from LSE that says that when you compare African cities, the French, former French colonies with former British colonies, the French colonies were gridded and the British colonies were not. And one of the side effects is that they are actually denser. So the argument that's being made in the paper is that gridded environments like Bamako, as compared to, let's say, British places like Dar es Salaam, turn out to be denser. So so that little things like that are the only policy differences that we can see now. We see a huge difference in density in, let's say, Bogota, which has become much denser over the last 25 years than in other places. And you ask, oh, is that a matter of policy? Yes, it was a matter of policy. There was fighting in the periphery of Bogota, and if you lived in the suburbs, you could be kidnapped. So nobody wanted to live in the suburbs. So the politics created density. But it was not necessarily the kind of politics that you'd want to do to encourage densification, but definitely a political influence on density. On the second thing, quickly, on the optimal density thing, I have started to do work, and it's not published yet, that basically says if you keep density as kind of one entity, we can't say much about it. But if we factor density into its components that when multiplied together give you density, and I'll list 5 of these components. People per square foot of floor area, which is like crowding. Floor area per building footprint, which is like building height. Plot coverage, which is building over the residential area. Residential share in land use, which is what share of the, and saturation of the urban extent by buildings. When you multiply these two together, you get people divided by urban extent, which is density. We did that for 10 cities. We actually have the numbers. And what you find is Hong Kong is denser than Kinshasa. But the reason that Hong Kong is denser is that it's high buildings, and in Kinshasa it's only 1 or 2 stories. But overcrowding in Kinshasa is 3 times that of Hong Kong. So overcrowding is what you don't want. So you have 5 things to think about. Overcrowding, which you can talk about optimal conditions, like what's the minimum amount of floor area that you'd like to have per person. Then plot coverage, because light and air is very much dependent on plot coverage, you can say something about that. Residential use, you can say how much open space you want in the city. So you can say about these optimums when you decompose, but not when you keep density as one element, when you're trying to get an optimum for this product of these 5 factors.
Thank you, Sully. Colin, would you like to weigh in on this?
Just one comment, really, was about the question of, just a question in general about learning from elsewhere, which I think is partly what you were kind of getting at in your first part of your question about drawing on ideas, policies which work in some places to other places, and just to flag up the kind of large literature in geography around this, around sort of urban policy mobility. And what I kind of take from a lot of that literature is, much of it by geographers, but not all of it, is the kind of, for me, the sort of primacy of context over travel. So what a lot of that literature shows is that even very well-meaning policies, when they shift from one place to another, what really dictates how they work will be the kind of political context in which they land. And of course, the political context which selects and interprets and translates ideas from elsewhere in particular ways. So we think about something like participatory budgeting, which, when it works well, can redistribute resources towards dense, poorer parts of the city to improve infrastructure, to improve services, and we've seen that happen. There are places where participatory budgeting has shifted resource to denser, poorer neighbourhoods. But there are many, many more accounts of how cities have taken participatory budgeting and turned it into something that isn't really in any way very progressive. It's a tokenistic kind of exercise that puts a friendly kind of social face on an otherwise market-driven, kind of development project or set of priorities for a city. So I think I would say context over travel, I guess. Not that learning from elsewhere is wrong, but the kind of need to kind of really prioritize the question of kind of context rather than learning from elsewhere.
Perfect. Thank you, Colin. So let's open it up again. Please identify yourself. Let's collect a few, and then we'll turn it back over to the panel. The floor is open, including from others at the table. Yes, Case.
We worked, Shlomo, we worked in the Future Cities Lab in Singapore, also on Java and some other areas like that. And one exercise we often do is we show the map of the division of world population, and then we show the map of world rice production. And then you see that those maps are almost identical. And it means that there are, apart from the kind of concentrated city areas, there are vast urbanized landscapes from Bangkok to the sea or along the Ganges, the whole of Java, that are at the same time the most populated areas in the world. So you could say they're almost urbanized. But at the same time, they are vital agricultural producers. This is even so in the Po area in Italy. Still almost lost, and it still is in the Netherlands because of the greenhouses. Now I'm curious about what you think for the future, because you say we have to urbanize 2.5 billion people still. These areas are clearly kind of gradually eating up green space. But a lot of policies are geared towards a kind of negative space concept in terms of preserving as much as possible unbuilt space and proliferating densification. But I see in your story that maybe that is a complete wrong direction of thinking. Can you say something about it?
So hold on to that. I'd like to collect, if that's okay. Yeah, take some notes if you would. Thank you, Case. So let's get a few other voices into this conversation. Brandon.
Hi, thank you both for the 2 very interesting presentations. I have a short question for Colin. I wanted to ask you what you think, if you think there's limits to the conceptualization of informality as in terms of multiplicities. So we have a lot by authors like Simone who talk about opening up the possibilities through these informal actions. to the multiplicities of urban and social life. And I wanted to know if you think there's a limit to that kind of conceptualization.
Thank you, Brandon. Who else? I'm looking at y'all. You want to come in? Yeah.
Well, I hope I can make it short. Well, I have two questions to both of you. The first one actually involved the discussion between Solo and Neil about the question of urbanization, where Neil's position, if I'm not wrong, is that a settlement-based urbanization is an obsolete category because, of course, urbanization historically is a process that, of course, transcends what we can call the scale of the settlement and the planetary scale. So, in a way, I tend to agree with Neil. I mean, Serdar himself called urbanization a process, not a form. At the same time, I also think there is something crucial that you put on the table, not against, but somehow to discuss this scenario, which is that even if the rural and the city within urbanization is no longer a clear-cut opposition, as and maybe has never been like that, I suspect. I mean, the urban revolution itself was propelled by the introduction of agriculture in a way. But there is actually a scale where we can, to a certain extent, create a dialectic, and which is the existential scale of the territory. In other words, what you said, when it comes to the city, I mean, the dense metropolis, we have exchange as a fundamental form of life. When it comes actually to agriculture territories or rural territories, there is this kind of proximity to the land. And actually, it's really interesting because I've been working on urban planning recently, on really regulatory planning, and you really see that there is an enormous pressure from those who actually finance this regulatory planning to get rid of subsistence agriculture and to reinforce agroforestry, automated agricultural production, which is exactly to intervene in that kind of existential dimension. So I think there, I agree with you, the settlement form still matters a lot. And perhaps is a point of entry to criticize the whole idea of urbanization as a kind of transcendental process. And then the question I have for Colin is very short. I mean, I really enjoy your presentation, but I really have problems with the category of informal, especially the way in which this resonates within architecture, because maybe for geographers and for activists especially, it's a very liberating category, which is in a way to also refuse state planning procedures. But in architecture, it becomes immediately a kind of downgrading lens through which actually to address, because these phenomena have, in a way, a form, which sometimes actually is very interesting and very ingenious. But in a way, informality is already a kind of way to somehow render this as a kind of spontaneous process that is partly spontaneous, partly also a reaction to very structural problems. And we know from the history of cities that slums have always been tolerated by the state and by capital because are basins for cheap labor force. And so in a way, I'm not sure that informality really makes justice of the way in which they really imply this kind of larger urban dialectics. Sorry for being too long.
That's great. Thank you very much, Pier Vittorio. Anyone from the floor? Yes, please. There's a mic right behind you. Thank you.
Just, I guess, two general comments. I forgot your name, but you.
Brandon.
Brandon, no.
Sorry, Andres.
Andres. So Andres was asking about policies or possible policies to achieve densification. And I guess something to add to what Professor Angel, sorry, I failed to present myself. I'm Nicolas. I work with Professor Angel at NYU. Something to add is things that you have seen in terms of achieving densities or kind of trying to promote something on top of what he was saying about how income and population growth explain most of the density, is the issue. So that's kind of if you were to think about how to increase densities. But one thing that you could see also in terms of policies is get rid of some restrictive regulations, because you can see sometimes that in a lot of cases places are not denser because there are restrictions that don't allow them to be denser. There are like building height restrictions and so on. So you tend to generally speaking, there is a limit on terms of the infrastructure and what it can carry. But a lot of times the building height restrictions are rather arbitrary. And so in terms of policy, there is room to revise these kind of restrictions and then see if there is actually potential for higher densification. That would happen. Normally the market would correct along those lines. And I guess the second question is along these lines of how do we manage to have maybe or achieve higher densities where there is room for them. We've seen somehow that the whole process of participatory planning somewhat ends up being at odds with this kind of general goal that we as planners have. Of course, there's a lot of NIMBYism involved, but you oftentimes see that from the planning perspective, having urban renewal and thinking, okay, we're not going to have two-story houses anymore, we're going to have taller buildings, and there's a huge outcry from the public and from the neighbors. Or if you were at buildings or allow one high-rise, that normally is contested heavily by the public. So right now, there is kind of this emergence or this tension on some ideal outcomes that you would find, and then what people want. And since there's so much prevalence right now on doing participatory plannings, I guess we have a big challenge there.
Thank you very much. Diane Davis is next up.
Well, this will be kind of quick. I wasn't going to ask the question, but as you'll see in a second, I think it makes sense to ask it, especially after the final or the penultimate comment by Pierre Vittorio. So I was thinking in the kind of little exchange between Colin and Shlomo when you switched of the discussion about the 1 in 3. You wanted to know whether you ended your comments by saying that this data is wrong. They're not 1 in 3 people living in slums. And you got up, little exchange about those numbers, but you used the word informal settlements, not slums. So I guess, and that I'm just want to throw on the table, because this panel was called Reforming the Discourse. And it doesn't mean that we have to stick to the themes, because we'll probably deviate from our themes also. But I guess I wanted to know, I'm less intrigued by the documentation of the spaces and the questions of density. They're all super important. But I'm thinking a little more about whether we need a better language to talk about the documentation, to talk about the demography, to talk about the spaces that we're seeing. So that loops me back again to the distinction between something that's called a slum, a word I hate. It's used by global agencies. I don't know, what that means. It's a concept that's not clear. It's an ideological concept. But we could also say an informal settlement is an ideological concept too. So my question to the panelists is, what is the language that we need to develop to talk about the distinctions that we know are in those spaces that are being graphed with big data? Colin, you're getting to it a little bit, and you have a lot of language, fragmented, et cetera, but I think we need something more intermediate in scale as a concept. I mean, I'm thinking conceptually and analytically, than just, and I'm like you, come down to the ground. I want to see what's actually happening. But I do think there's a lacuna in the way we're talking about urbanization that particularly with respect to distinctions, not just income distinctions, or not just property rights distinctions, or not even just aesthetic distinctions, that we're capturing different types of experiences in large categories of spaces, and none of that is coming through in the big graphics that we have.
Thank you, Diane. So we have just about 10 minutes left. So if anyone from the floor, I'm just inviting you all one more time, wants to weigh in, this is your chance. Anyone? Rahul? Please.
My name's Ogden. I was studying density in the 70s, particularly from the standpoint of the new towns in and around outside of London, and the effect of new towns on the redistribution of property and the de-densification of certain areas of London, which were considered to be slummy, but at the same time, from the point of view of Jane Jacobs, they were vital. They had sufficient density even though the economy was not particularly wealthy. There were sufficient people to generate a lot of activity within the areas. And when they were moved to the new towns, the density proportionality was destroyed. And the planning aspect and the mentality of planners at that point was not necessarily particularly favorable towards the organic density patterns that Jane Jacobs had basically observed as an empiricist. And she realized that that was a very important intrinsic aspect of city life. And that sometimes urbanization, such as the Model Cities program, swept it out, cleaned it, because the whole objective was to get rid of it. Some of it was redlining, and some of it was the development of the suburbs. But what's interesting about Boston is that the whole process is reversed. And the redensification of Boston is a very interesting process, which started occurring. And then the aspects of Jane Jacobs started creeping back into the system, where all of a sudden the life and vitality became restored on the city streets, such as Newbury Street and other areas. And so that was my thing, that I was able to criticize urban planning from that standpoint. But only because Jane Jacobs had actually created the ground for that to occur.
Thank you very much. So we need to turn it back over to the panel. If I may take 2 minutes just briefly to respond to some of the issues Solly raised related to some of my work. Just really quick. So the settlement-based conception of the urban has been kind of under discussion, and Pierre Vittorio raised it. So the thing for me is, so Solly is incredibly systematic in his attempt to empirically document the transformation of urban land area. And the majority of scholars on my reading who embrace a settlement-based conception of the urban, they reify the urban. They don't do what Solly's been doing, which is to actually empirically track the process of spatial transformation of metropolitan zones. So my main critique is launched at just the naturalized assumption that the city is a bounded settlement space, by definition. And Solly is interested in bounding it, and we can have a longer conversation about why do you want to bound it. But he doesn't simply presuppose that it is necessarily bounded, because the whole problematique of your empirical research is to map the transformation. And that's the point also that Pierre Vittorio raised. So Christian Schmid and I refer to concentrated urbanization as a process. And basically, Shlomo Angel, is among the most systematic sort of scholars to try to document empirically the changing sort of spatial parameters of concentrated urbanization. So the provocation that I would offer is, are you really embracing, like you say that you embrace a settlement-based conception, and I understand, you've made it very clear, and I find it very powerful, that there are policy reasons why we need one. But actually, when I look at your research practice, you're not really bounding it. I mean, there's a moment of bounding, but you're also tracking a process of transformation. So at minimum, there are both elements. And the one other thread of our work, which to some degree connects up with the European Commission position that you're criticizing, is what Christian Schmid and I call extended urbanization, which is basically the ongoing transformations outside of that concentrated area that contribute to some of the issues that emerge within it. And your whole discussion today, you continually referred to various ways in which extra city, or we could say rural, in-migration is contributing to urban land expansion. So for our work, we want to open up, as it were, that black box of what's actually going on in the putative countryside. Like, we need to look at that in concrete, embedded context to see what kinds of land use, property relation, political, ecological transformations are contributing to that. And then whether that's part of the urban fabric of the world or not, that's an empirical question. But we at least want to open that up. So it's not just saying everything is therefore urbanized in the same way. It's an empirical, it's a frame for asking empirical questions. Okay, we now need to turn it back over to our two panelists. They have a lot of work to do with the various points that have been raised. But I invite you simply to pick and choose. We just have a few minutes. Respond to anything that you feel provoked to respond to. And obviously the conversation will continue after the break. Up to you all to work that one out. But take a minute or two each if you see fit.
I won't speak for long. I guess it's about informality, most of the questions that were kind of related to me, although I do think there is something about the last point about density that I think is very important, in the sense that, you know, it's not a question of whether cities want or don't want density. I think what your question opens up is that particular kinds of densities become ideologically or aesthetically or politically desirable, whilst others are made not to be. So many of the cities that are destroying densities are doing so in the name of density. You know, let's have new urbanism, but let's not have slum densities. You know, that kind of logic. So I think there's a lot of the politics around density is the ways in which density is conceived and put to work, and that's another way in which density becomes a resource, as a kind of political resource for politicians and developers and so on and so, people like Andres Douani and so on and so forth. I'm just going to just say a couple of things about informality. One is that I kind of, you know, I sort of move back and forward between the term informal neighbourhoods and popular neighbourhoods and informal settlements, and I kind of move back and forward between these kind of terms, partly because, you know, like a lot of people working in this area, you kind of inhabit this sort of anxiety about the concepts you might use. You know, there's a risk, I think, of overstating the difference between these neighbourhoods and the rest of the city, and you know, in sort of signalling them out as somehow apart from the city, when they are as much a city as any other neighbourhood. And of course, none of us want to imply that, but there's a kind of risk that you're kind of aware of when you're talking. The same thing, you want to talk about neighbourhoods like that are, you know, very deeply, as I was saying, kind of materially fragmented, often denied basic rights, legal representation, all kinds of questions that we know about. So I tend to move between the two. My kind of feeling is that, you know, because it's such a deeply political terrain, using the word slum seems to me to be, you know, Mike Davis's book was an extremely important book. It opened up a lot of space in urban studies for us to think about these kind of questions. But I was kind of shocked. I'm still a bit shocked that he kind of used that term without really any critical reflection, given its history. I still find that bizarre. So we do need a new language. I don't have an answer to that. I think the informal formal is a kind of useful heuristic device. You know, to go back to Brandon's, it opens up a way of starting to talk about neighbourhoods or indeed forms of labour, which are often on the edges of legal and material provisioning. And I think that's a kind of useful kind of frame to keep in mind, as long as we do caveat and think about some of the problems of those that I alluded to. But what I'm trying to do is then say, well, it doesn't take you very far, right? I mean, there's only so far you can take the informal-formal relation as a way of understanding urbanism. And that's why I'm starting to use concepts like social infrastructure, of care, coordination, speculation. That's why I'm thinking about fragments as, in terms of both material fragments and knowledge fragments. I didn't talk about knowledge fragments today. You know, there's a vocabulary that we need to kind of populate to kind of conceptualize life, which doesn't. It's not the habitus of the poor, but it's not like poor people speculate with social infrastructures and other people don't. But it's about trying to name kind of forms of life which are ways of organising or conditions which are perhaps more pronounced in neighbourhoods which are very poor, right? So I mean, everybody's experience of a city is about fragments in some way or another. But in informal neighbourhoods, we see a lot more of those material fragments. So what does that mean then for how we theorise those places? So I think informality I would see as a kind of opener, and and then we start to kind of populate a kind of grammar of conceptualization. And this is why I mentioned a few times Abdelmalek Simon, because I think that Abdelmalek, if you look through his work, and he does it in a very kind of frustratingly Deleuzian way sometimes, he doesn't like to kind of like, here's a concept and this is what it's about. But, if you read across his books, what you start to see is that he's effectively breaking ground, I think, with a new grammar of informal urbanism in all sorts of ways. I think the point about informality in architecture being this kind of connoting this kind of notion of spontaneity is a really important reminder. And I think I'm kind of really aware of that. I tend to talk a lot to urban geographers, and we sort of take for granted, I think, more often that, informality, of course, is, the kind of Mike Davis reading of informality as a product of, for example, structural adjustment policies. And thinking about informality as in a kind of wider capitalist context kind of comes with a territory, I think, in a lot of urban geography and lots of other urban studies discussions. But it's what we then do with that. Do we, is that a kind of question of then, getting rid of that term in certain contexts? And I think that's where we haven't got as Diane says, the language. I'll stop talking. I can feel you agitating. I think I'll leave it there. But just the last thing was, I think you alluded to it, the word form in informal. I mean, I think that's something that we could really think more about. What kinds of imaginaries? And I think this is, for me, something which I need to think a little bit more about, because on the one hand, I want the word informal to remind us of the fragmented nature of material life in informal neighbourhoods, but I'm also aware that then kind of restricts thinking about the spatialities of urban informality to those very kinds of forms, which has itself a very political, freighted history, in the way in which people like Dickens, for example, would write about the slum. It's that kind of imaginary. So I'm very aware of that contradiction there in form in terms of the freighting of it. So that's helpful. I'll think more about that.
Thank you, Colin. Solly is always extremely concise, and I've got to ask you to be extremely concise because, in fact, we are almost out of time. But take your pick, Solly, of what you'd like to address.
Thank you. I have to address a few issues. I'll try to address them really quickly. I think that when we talk about standards of density, I'm all in favor of density. The only thing that bothers me is overcrowding. So if we can do density without overcrowding, I'm all for it. So we've failed at densification, by the way, up until now. We've been trying to do it for 30 years. As Nicholas was saying, a lot of resistance to densification. So at least I don't want planners to say we will densify without telling us how. So you want to densify? Fine. Otherwise, we're going to have expansion. So what we're doing is we're doing some research of densification versus expansion to see what the potential is for densification, and if not, we're going to have expansion. But you can't just leave it and hope that other people take care of it. That's the first thing. The second, to respond to what Pierre Vittorio and Neil was saying about settlement-based definitions of the urban. In a way, you can say all settlements are urban. It doesn't really matter. What it would mean is that then we're talking about shifts of population within those settlements, from the smallest to the largest. So Gibrat's law, for example, says, let's say, for cities of 100,000 or more, they're all growing at the same rate. But the little ones are not. The little ones are losing population and are emptying. Okay, so we're going to have just a redistribution of the population, which I call urbanization. So, but you can look at all of that as kind of the reorganization of the urban. That would be the same to me. That wouldn't change anything that I'm doing from what I'm doing now. I'd like to respond to Diane's terminology issues. The reason that I don't like the slum idea, which is a 19th century idea, that somehow Habitat chose to revive after we've been telling them for 30 years not to use it and to use spontaneous settlements, informal settlements, and they reinvented the idea of slums. The thing that I don't like about slums is it never tells me how you to graduate. You know, okay, so I'm a slum. Now, how do I stop being a slum? What do I have to do to stop being a slum? And one of the great examples that I want to point out is actually the grid. And that is, my favorite example is in Comas, in Pampa de Comas, which is 8 kilometers outside Lima, where I was spending my time when I was still a student in 1969. It's a squatter settlement. There was an invasion. But before it was invaded, this was organized by radical priests. And the priests got the students from the engineering department of San Marcos University to come and survey the land before the invasion. So they left 10-meter roads and 10 by 20-meter plots. And then in the invasion, everybody invaded, illegal, informal, you want to call it what, built a little shack in the middle and start to dig a trench all around the property to say, this is mine, and then gradually build a wall. Now, Comas is now one of the most desirable neighborhoods in Lima. A house there, formerly a squatter house, they got tenure during the time of Fujimori, costs $185,000. And it has completely shed its informal, spontaneous, whatever that has disappeared. So for me, the informal is the result of having a stacked deck that prevents the poor from doing what they want to do. The land markets are dysfunctional, the regulations are unsuitable, the property rights don't meet their needs. It basically, so all of this informality is a process of coping with the impossible. And it's therefore, it's kind of low resource development, which is illegal and generally unplanned, but could be part of the city. So and that's my last point. My last point is, how do we incorporate informality into the next 2.5 billion people who are coming in? And my solution to that, again, just to make it simple for everybody, is the grid. And that is, you create an arterial grid 1 kilometer apart of 30-meter roads that would make sure that the city is planned. Within that, if you have unplanned informal settlements, it's okay. But what it will do is it will make it possible for these informals to be part of the metropolitan labor market. Because one thing is clear, and that is the island is not going to be the solution. We live in metropolitan economies where everybody lives and works in the metropolitan area as a whole. And even these new towns that we heard about, that there was supposed to be live-work communities, the successful ones are parts of metropolitan areas. The ones that were supposed to be live-work communities were failures. So we have metropolitan economies, not statewide, metropolitan economies. That's why Craigslist is one Craigslist per metropolitan area and not 200 and 300 little community Craigslist. And we need to integrate these informals by making them part of the metropolitan area. If you have 1 million people in the informal settlements outside Abidjan, they just feed on each other. You know, I cook your food, you cut my hair, you take care of my children, I help you build your house. That's not how you create an economy. To create an economy, you have to export goods and services. And therefore, these informals, in order to survive, have got to be part of the metropolitan labor market. And that's why we need the grid to connect them with public transport into the metropolitan area as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Solly Angel. Thank you, Colin McFarlane. Thanks to all of you for your provocative questions. Let me now turn it over to one of the conference organizers to tell us, we're just a little behind schedule, 10 minutes or so, I think.
So now we have 8 minutes for a coffee break, and we will return back here at sharply at 3, and we can start panel 3.
Let's give it a round of applause.